Good morning. It's early on a Friday morning. Um, I thought I'd use the quiet this morning to share with you some devotional thoughts for week 19 after Pentecost. We are in year A, continuing through Matthew's Gospel, and brings us to Matthew 22, 1 through 14. And Matthew 22, 1 through 14 brings us to the parable of the great feast. Um, Jesus, in in these chapters here in later in Matthew, speaking a lot to um, the second coming, the time when he will return for his people, and so like last week we saw that in the parable of the evil farmers, and even in the in some of these others, and we're going to continue to see that especially as we end up in Matthew 24 and 25, Jesus teaching about uh, his return and the great judgment. So here we end up with this feast, Matthew 22, again a parable, some meaning to that, and here's how it goes: Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Jesus also told them other parables. He said, "The kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a king who prepared a great wedding feast for his son. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify those who were invited, but they all refused to come. So he sent other servants to tell them, 'The feast has been prepared, the bulls and the fatted cattle have been killed, everything is ready, come to the banquet.' But the guest had ignored them. But the guest he had invited ignored them and went their own way, one to his farm, another to his own business. Others seized his messages and insulted them and killed them. The king was furious. He sent out his army to destroy the murderers and burn their town. And he said to his servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, and the guests I invited aren't worthy of honor. Now go out to the street corners and invite everyone you see.' So the servants brought in everyone they could find, good and bad alike, and the banquet hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to meet the guest, he noticed that a man who wasn't wearing the proper clothes for a wedding. 'Friend,' he asked, 'how is it that you are here without wedding clothes?' But the man had no reply. And the king said to his aides, 'Bind his hands and feet and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Interesting passage that we find here in Matthew. And really, again, I believe Jesus is speaking of the Pharisees, of the Jewish people who have been invited to the great wedding feast. They were God's chosen people, and yet they rejected him. They ignore the fact that Jesus struggled with the Pharisees. He didn't struggle, but the Pharisees and Jesus definitely had some words over that time, and so they're struggling with this idea of Jesus, um, and so this is really a case that uh, they weren't ready. They were rejecting it. Really, this goes back to the last thing that Matthew is writing when he talks about the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Jesus was being rejected by the established Jewish people, and and he's showing what's going to happen. And this is where we get an idea that now not only the Jewish people are going to be allowed to be part of the kingdom, but so are the Gentiles. And he invites everyone. Now, I don't exactly know what to do with that last part, where the man came to the uh, and didn't have the proper clothes on, unless because I would imagine that because there was good and bad alike, and the banquet hall was filled with guests. But somehow he was not prepared. I'm going to say it that way. He was not. He was invited to the feast, but was not prepared, and therefore thrown out. And that can be us. We've been invited to the feast, and we go, but we haven't properly prepared our hearts um, to be uh, to be at the table. And I think that we need to always be prepared. And so we have been invited. God is inviting all of us to the table to receive the great wedding feast. And I hope that it reminds me of the song by Sidewalk Prophets called "Come to the Table," and it says we all start on the outside looking in, and this is where grace begins. And he says, "Come to the table." It doesn't matter who you are invited to the table. So come to the table, prepare your heart, and join in God's feast for you. Blessings.